Welcome to Chapter 16, Part 1, where we begin our look at Reconstruction, the time period after the Civil War, where we have to try to bring the nation back together, where we wonder who's in charge of letting the southern states back into the Union, where we have to figure out how to fix up the South after the destruction caused by the war, and what to do with the newly freedmen as well. Even with the Civil War still raging, Lincoln began thinking about the process of restoring the Union once the war was over. In what becomes known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction Plan, or his 10% plan, Lincoln sets forth on December 8, 1863, his ideas of how to bring the Union back together. He believed that he would provide amnesty to all who would take an oath of loyalty, and when 1/10 of the number of voters of 1860 had taken that oath, then the state could send representatives back to Congress and establish state governments. Now you can tell this plan was very lenient and mild and forgiving towards the South, for Lincoln's whole goal was to get the Union back together as quickly as possible and move on from this big mess. And that's the approach that he took. However, it kind of upset other people that wanted to punish the South. And therefore, we see the creation of what's known as the Wade-Davis Bill. Passed by Congress in July of 1864, this was an unsuccessful attempt by the radical wing of the Republicans in Congress to try and set Reconstruction policy prior to the end of the Civil War. The belief here was that they were going to try to, in this bill, abolish slavery, make the South deny secession. It would keep Confederate officials from voting or holding office. It would establish military governors to kind of watch over these southern states. And then when a majority, or at least 50% of the state's citizens swore an allegiance, they could establish a constitutional convention and apply for statehood. Now this was a much more stringent, punishing plan, one that Lincoln never signs and basically vetoes through the pocket veto. So even though Congress and the President can't agree on how to bring the South back into the Union, they do agree upon the 13th Amendment, which states neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now you see, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed African Americans in rebel states, but it was the 13th Amendment that emancipated all U.S. slaves. It's passed in April of 1864 in the Senate. It passes the House of Representatives in January of 1865 and is eventually ratified by the states in December of 1865. But now that they were freed, the freed blacks were surrounded by many hostile whites, and life doesn't necessarily get a whole lot better. But to help the freedmen adjust, Congress establishes in March of 1865 something known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This provided aid to over 4 million freed slaves, and it was trying to assist them and transition from slavery to freedom. It was run by the War Department and kind of introduced a system of free labor in the South. Now, it didn't help just the freedmen, but it also helped poor whites, as there were millions of whites in the South that were left, hurting by the Civil War. Despite inadequate funding and poorly trained personnel, the Freedmen's Bureau built hospitals, gave medical assistance, gave food to more than 1 million freedmen, and established over 3,000 schools. So this bureau was an attempt to try to help those freedmen and poor whites adjust to the post-Civil War era. During this time, it wasn't just the Freedmen's Bureau that provided assistance, but we also witnessed Northerners moving south to try to help rebuild society. And a negative connotation is given to them by the Southerners, who kind of see them as meddling in areas that's not really, their affairs. And these Northerners become known as carpetbaggers. And they may try to establish businesses to rebuild the South, or they may try to run for public office on the Republican ticket to try to maybe better their lives and the lives of those living in the South. Or they just kind of came down trying to maybe teach in these freedmen schools, or helping out in other ways rebuild Southern society. Regardless, they were kind of looked at as invaders and kind of scoffed at by the Southerners, who didn't really want them down there. And another derogatory term is scalawags, and these were white Southerners who actually kind of switched from maybe being Democrats to probably being Republicans. Maybe they ran for office to try to get personal gain or wealth out of it, knowing that the freedmen would more likely vote for them. But they also looked to kind of better themselves, and sometimes were looked at in an evil way as well, because they were looked at kind of changing their alliance away from kind of the white dominant Southern society. And with all the changes taking place, you can kind of imagine how some of the white Southerners felt, especially when it came to the Freedmen's Bureau. They kind of had the idea that the freedmen were being provided everything and given a whole new way of life that was kind of dependent upon the government and didn't really have to work for anything. So the South, kind of didn't really agree with this, kind of federal government coming in and trying to impose all these changes. And so eventually, what we're going to see is that even though the freedmen had kind of seen an increase in status, something we'll take a look at in future episodes, eventually they're going to get the right to vote, and they're going to be provided, jobs and work besides just being slaves. You're going to see a backlash by the Southern whites, who are eventually going to try to reclaim their power and kind of reestablish the old social hierarchy. But these are things we'll take a look at in our next episode.